what I want everyone to take away, let's just take a moment to like understand that and like fathom that and understand what these children went through and understand how unprotected they were, how exploited they were, what they had to live through, and just understand the heaviness of that generational trauma for a second. Let's just like sit here in reverence of that. But what I want to point out is the indigenous population, Native Americans, First Nations people are still fucking here. Okay? And I just want to hammer that point home because it is amazing that you are still here. It is amazing that you are still able to pass traditions down. It is amazing that you are still steadfast in your community existing because of how hard they actively tried to kill you off. And despite every obstacle, despite everything put in your way, despite everything done to hurt you, to minimize your contributions to society, to minimize your help in creating society, to minimize your existence, you remain here. Not only that, but your traditions remain here. And that says so much to me. Because some people may ask, like, well, why do this? Why would they do this? And the reality is, the existence and the continued existence of the indigenous population in Northern America is a direct threatening of the legitimacy of the Europeans' claim that this is their land. The fact that you still exist is going to constantly always be a threat to their legitimacy of owning or ownership or creation of this land, of this society. And that is why they will try and try and try and try through different avenues, through different ways, through the different generations to try and make sure you don't exist, but you still exist. So understand that. That's beautiful. That's powerful. And I draw a lot of inspiration from just the tenacity, the force, the passion, the power of indigenous people and everything. So hello. My name is Madison and welcome to the Madison channel. If you are returning, hi, how are you? It's been a while. Like the video, comment on the video. I hope you enjoy. If you are new here, please like, subscribe, comment down below, hit that notification bell so you're alerted when I make a new video. Typically, I do videos once a week. Lately, I've been off my game, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But today, we are going to be discussing residential schools as a true crime story. Let's get into it. So before we get into me explaining residential schools as a true crime story, I just want to lay down a little bit of, housekeeping and stuff like that. First and foremost, hi, how are you? It's been a long time and I'm very, very sorry. Your girl has been social more than I've ever been social in like the past 3 years. I went to New York for a few days for my friend Laura's birthday. I went to 2 weddings. I just got back from one. One was in the Bay Area. I just started a new job a month ago. So I've been all over the place in scatterbrain Jane, and I have not been as on my schedule as I want to be. So I want to apologize publicly for that. And we will be getting back into that through this month, through next month, and through January, through the new year. So I just want to let you know, I'm sorry. I know it's been a while. Secondly, I just want to let y'all know that for this month of November, we are going to be discussing some of the atrocities that have been done to our Native American, First Nations, indigenous people in the Northern America hemisphere, okay? I wanted to deliberately use the month of November to talk about, highlight, and discuss these stories for many reasons, mostly because this is a month of Thanksgiving. And in America, if you celebrate Thanksgiving, it is kind of this moment in time. The food's bomb, but it's a moment in time where a lot of Americans have selective amnesia about how America as a country came to be. We're supposed to be giving thanks, but the origin story, obviously, of Thanksgiving involves indigenous people. And, if you go back to my very first video, you understand that a lot of what we are told is true. A lot of the history we are told is reality, has a lot of mythos attached to it. And it's not until much later you realize that, like, what you were told growing up as a kid, what you were indoctrinated to believe as the relationship between Europeans and Native Americans and vice versa, is pretty much all false, you know? So the origin story for Thanksgiving has to do with Native American people and, pilgrims coming together and sharing this meal. I don't know if that's verifiable or not, but I just want us to recognize the truth behind the reality of Thanksgiving, the truth behind, what our Native American brothers and sisters and non binary individuals had to go through at the hands of European colonizers, settler colonialists, in the hopes of creating America as we see it today. And I think that we get caught up in the family and the yummy food, and we don't really understand that, this day, this Thanksgiving day, is indicative of the atrocities that our fellow man, our fellow woman, our fellow non binary Native American, indigenous brother or sister or person had experienced. So I just think it's important to use this month to talk about some of these things. And I wanted to talk about residential schools first, because I was inspired to do this after listening to the podcast, this Missing and Murdered Finding Cleo. Now, I listened to that way like 2 years ago, and I've been waiting and waiting and waiting to do that story. And that story discusses something called the 60 scoop. And a lot of this is synonymous with both America proper, United States of America, the 50 states, as well as Canada. So I'm going to kind of talk about them in an interchangeable way because their histories are kind of intertwined in terms of what they did, how they did it, and when they did it. But I found this podcast, which I highly recommend, Missing and Murdered Finding Cleo, which is about the 60s scoop, which is another situation that specifically targeted Indigenous, Native American, First Nations people in Canada specifically. But I realized that I couldn't tell that story properly without talking about the residential school system as it stood, as it existed. So I decided to take a step back, do a full video on residential schools. Then next week, I'm going to do the full video on the 60s scoop so that we're all on the same page with context and everything. But yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say. So without further ado, is there anything else I wanted to say? I just want to quickly shout out my sister and this absolutely gorgeous dream journal. It is a 12-week guided dream journal that has amazing prompts. It is absolutely super comprehensive to use and super high quality. Highly, highly recommend it. If you're interested in this, hit my Amazon storefront link in the bio so you can purchase it and try it out. Hope you love it. First, mostly, I think the most important thing to start off with is discussing the different types of genocidal acts that can be done to a particular group of people. I think when we think the word genocide, a lot of us think Holocaust, a lot of us think Rwandan genocide, Armenian genocide, a lot of us think these things. Which are obviously examples of genocide. But a lot of us don't understand that genocide isn't always done in that kind of brutal, targeting, murdering kind of way. In fact, a lot of the time it's done in subtle, systematic ways. And I think we are intentionally not taught about the other acts of genocide for the purpose of us being ignorant to recognizing them. For the purpose of us being ignorant to realizing that a lot of the things that we're doing internationally or to people of color in our own country resemble genocidal acts. And it's just easier to have a more docile population that isn't up to date or understanding of what genocide actually is and what it entails. So under this big umbrella of genocide, there are several things that count as genocide. So one of them is specifically targeting a group of people and sectioning them off from the community. Another part is intentionally adopting out a particular group of people's children so that they are no longer being influenced by their community. Another one is particularly segregating a particular group of people in conditions that are basically unlivable, so they end up killing themselves. And there's several in this list, but these are just examples that I'm putting out to show you the subtleties involved in defining something as a genocidal act. So when we're talking about boarding schools in America or residential schools in Canada, what a lot of people don't do is contextualize that system as a genocidal act. They just say, this happened and it was messed up, or this happened, period. And they don't say the fullness of what needs to be said after that. Because the effects of the residential schools and boarding schools that were established both in the United States and Canada had similar effects to genocide on the indigenous Native American communities. And it's important that we understand that, understand the full weight of that, understand the full breadth of that. And when it comes to my next video on the 60 scoop, it'll all kind of make sense in this kind of way. But I just thought that that is an important thing that we need to acknowledge before we get into this. So I guess the first thing is defining a residential / boarding school. Now, okay. Let me put this into even more context, right? The Native population lived and thrived in the Americas for millennia, centuries, generation upon generation. They lived and thrived. They had different tribes, different traditions, intricate traditions that were passed down orally from one person to the next, right? Europeans come. Well, first Africans come, but that's a conversation for another day. Europeans come and they see an opportunity with the precious metal, the rich soil, lots of things that North America had to offer, and they decide to go the murderous route, right? So you have a good segment of the Native population being killed off just by being sick from the diseases the Europeans came and brought. Another population of the Native, another grouping of the Native population being killed off because of them being enslaved and overworked and just plain, labor, manual labor used to extract the precious metals and different things that were in the Native American soil and zeitgeist, right? Then you have another population of natives intentionally targeted and murdered. Okay, now this is something that a lot of people don't talk about, but there is something, it's storming outside, hold on. Now, let's talk about it. There's something that we don't always discuss in American history, which is the dark side of manifest destiny. Again, refer to my first ever YouTube video to talk about white myth making and how our history is mostly stories that are folklore. But manifest destiny was a concept that was made up in order for white people to feel like God told them to move west. The dark side of that is in their movement west, a bunch millions, thousands, hundreds of thousands of indigenous people were murdered in order to free up land and space for these settler colonialists, right? So when we talk about things like manifest destiny or even the Second Amendment in the Constitution, that was created so the average cowboy or the average person moving west could help the entire government eradicate the native population from inhabiting certain spaces out west so that it could be, colonized by white people. A lot of people don't talk about that, right? But a lot of our laws and rules and regulations in our Constitution, in our life, have some basis in a racist past and a racist history. So we have the group of people that died because of the diseases brought, the group of people that were worked to death, the group of people that were intentionally targeted and murdered, right? Now we're at a place where it's not as acceptable to just flat out murder a whole ethnic group of people. It's not as tolerated. It's harder to convince people that it's okay. And there comes this big question: what are we going to do with the rest of the native population? Mind you, all of the things that I detailed killed 55 million Native American people in North America, including Canada. 55 million indigenous people were murdered because of the things that I just listed. But now we're at a time where, okay, there's still some of the native population that exists. What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to deal with the fact that, okay, we killed as many as we could of you, there's still some of you that are here, and how are we supposed to coexist? Okay, so what do? They section off the native population into reservations and give them parcels of land. And some of these treaties are sketchy. A lot of these treaties aren't actually acknowledged or respected, but again, another genocidal act of separation from the collective into places that likely have subpar conditions for survival, in the hopes that, that will mean that there are less and less and less Native American people who exist. Okay? So these are the subtleties of genocide that are starting to creep in. Then we have the advent of the boarding school / residential school. And a boarding school / residential school is a school that is mandated and controlled by the state, oftentimes with a Catholic religious aspect to it. There are some Presbyterian, but a lot of Catholic churches controlled the residential schools in Canada and America. And this is a mandatory place where indigenous children are taken away from their parents and put into like a boarding school style. They were in school for most of the year, and in these schools they were forbidden from speaking their language. Their hair was forced to be cut. They were encouraged to adopt whatever religion the school was practicing, and basically they were encouraged to abandon completely who they are. All right, so that they can assimilate into the culture around them, which was European culture in both America and in Canada. Okay, so residential schools were the next form of the genocidal acts committed against the indigenous population. It was the extension of the reservation. Now we're taking your young, okay, who don't know all the traditions, who haven't gone through all the milestones that are important in your culture. We're taking them young. We're making sure they can never learn, talk, or speak their native tongue. We're making sure that we strip them of all the things that make them traditionally, culturally Native American. And we're going to try to assimilate them into white culture so that generations from this generation in the residential school will not have a connection to indigenous culture and traditions, which was the goal, okay? which was the goal. So, talking specifically in Canada, and I'm just going to read it off my notes, okay? Over the course of the system's more than 100-year existence, around 150,000 children were placed in residential schools nationally in Canada. By the 1930s, about 30% of Indigenous children were believed to be attending residential schools. The number of school-related deaths remains unknown due to an incomplete historical record, conveniently, but estimates range from 3,200 to upwards of 6,000. Now, that number, again, is sketchy. These are all estimates, but there has recently been found mass graves of children on the campuses of some of these residential schools in Canada. And there's a process for which they're starting to dig up these mass graves. So that number is a very conservative estimate in my mind of what actually happened to the children that attended these schools. But yeah, these were things that became mandatory over time to take the Indigenous children in the area and force them to basically erase their culture so they had no connection to who they once were. Of course, as you can expect, in schools with very little oversight, with a very high racialized, thing happening by particularly targeting a specific group of people to go to these schools, there was massive amounts of abuse, physical, sexual, hard labor. Lots of kids died and were never or disappeared. So when I say those numbers are conservative, they are really truly conservative. But the residential / boarding school system was completely atrocious. It was an atrocity committed against the native population for the purpose of essentially erasing them from existing off of this part of the world where they have always existed, which is sick. And I just want to sit here for a second and understand, now that I've defined what a residential school is, right? And understand how much of a wrecking ball these schools were to the Indigenous population. Because, like me, as being obviously African American, but in the African diaspora, a lot of Indigenous people's traditions were not written in the way that European histories were recorded. And because of that, there was this untrue assumption that Africans and Native Americans, any Indigenous population really, they were less civilized than Europeans because they didn't record their histories in the exact same way that Europeans did, right? Which is obviously untrue because, we know that the Indigenous people had very advanced things that still cannot be accounted for to this day. And a lot of them were more advanced than Europe for many years before Europe caught up. But because of this tradition of not writing things down exactly how Europeans did, that deemed these categories of people as being closer to animals or uncivilized. Of course, that definition was defined by those subjugating us and, taking advantage of us. So by creating residential schools and targeting the young population, there was a deliberate effort to make sure that these kids never had a connection to their cultural roots, because they knew that these traditions were passed down by milestones, passed down orally, these stories, the way the language worked, passed down orally. So by taking them away at such a ripe and tender age, a lot of them, were robbed of the opportunity to be culturally immersed in their traditional culture. And, that leads to a lot of other conversations that we'll get into later. But I just want to hammer that home because that is the perfect example of systematic racism. One of the most perfect examples I could ever think of. It's not physically violent in terms of I'm targeting you, I'm hunting you down, I'm killing you because you are this. It is this diabolical way behind the scenes to be able to bureaucratically take control of people's lives, take agency away from specific groups of people, and make sure that you can still get the same effect of eradicating a whole population by changing up how you do it. And I think that's just like one of the darkest things about these countries, about European history, about all of these things, because it really is truly sick and diabolical what they have done to the Native population, to the African American population, honey, to all marginalized people of color's population, right? And this is why I want to talk about it as a true crime story, because we need to broaden our definition of what a true crime story is. To me, this has all of the violence, all of the premeditated action as a murder, pretty much. They were murdering the future of indigenous people. They were murdering, their intention was to murder off the future, the agency of the indigenous population. And all this group of people did was exist.
Had me fooled. And you too, Mrs. Spears. Death to all of them.
The other part of this, which is why I'm trying to contextualize this so much, is that there is a huge hole now in these indigenous communities, an entire age group, entire population, because a lot of these kids were taken extremely, extremely young. So there were a lot of people who had very little memory of living with their parents or living under the traditional guise of the traditions of being Native American or First Nations people. A lot of kids were taken so young that all they remember is the residential school. So by doing that, you're stealing an entire generation of a community of being able to then learn these traditions and pass it down to their children and so on and so forth. But on top of that, nobody talks about the parents. Like, in all research that I've done and all what I've learned in class and all of this kind of stuff, when it comes to residential schools, very rarely is a conversation about the parents centered, because this particular group of marginalized people did not adhere to the traditions that Europeans thought to be acceptable, but they shouldn't have to, because they were awarded sovereignty to be on reservations and things like that, to rule as they want to. You know what I mean? But because they didn't adhere to European ideals of how to raise children, it gave the state the ability to kind of blur the lines about what is an acceptable place for children to grow up as, and how are they supposed to be growing up, and how are they supposed to be reared. It created this really intense gray area that basically gave the state the free will to see a child who was indigenous, snatch him up, and put him in a boarding school. It later became mandated for it to be state, your child has to be in a residential school. So the parents now have their own children being ripped from their arms, okay? Sometimes they could visit their kids, sometimes they wouldn't be allowed to. It depended on the case. Some kids stayed there year round, other kids were able to visit their parents, but again, their connection to their culture was dwindling because of how the schools were teaching them about it, right? And they're young and they're impressionable. So you start to see this cycle start where there's this aggressive, traumatizing ripping of children from family, throwing them into boarding schools where they're going to be abused in all manner of abuse, malnourished, terrible conditions, physically abused, sexually abused. And then they grow up and they grow out of the residential school system and then somehow either have to establish themselves in society after suffering years of traumatizing ish, or go back to their tribes and where they came from to not have any connection to it at all. And that kind of makes an internal thing. I don't know, like generational trauma is so fucking real, right? Because imagine that happening to you being ripped from your family and thrown somewhere where you're unsafe, unprotected, underfed, undercared for. And then you grow up in that space, learning to cope, learning to survive. And then you have to grow up and then exist and get a job or do something with your life in order to survive. And there's all of this baggage and trauma that you're carrying that you were too young to understand. So we're starting to see how that then relates to, okay, this huge generational cycle of the state taking children from indigenous people, and how it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because these people are being targeted, traumatized, forced to try and establish a life for themselves when they are unable to fully unpack the depth and the breadth of trauma they had to experience and endure. Them having kids and then the state taking those kids away because these parents are unfit. But why are they unfit? You see what I mean? So it becomes this cyclical thing where now we've traumatized these people so much that we can just take their kids freely because now they can't be functioning. Now there's so much baggage and trauma attached to their existence that it becomes easier and easier to justify taking their children away. And then it becomes this cyclical thing of trauma, re-trauma, trauma, re-trauma, until we're at the 60s scoop and kids are just being adopted out to white families. And we'll get there another day. But you see how that works, the diabolical nature for how that works. And we're never taught about that. We're just taught about these things existing and we move past it. Or maybe, these atrocities happen and we move past it, but not really feeling, empathizing, and understanding what this did and the reverberations of what this did to a community.
System took away my language, my culture, and my identity. I'm a residential school survivor from the Cree community of Moose Factory, Ontario. My mom and dad were hunters and trappers, and we survived off the land. Cree was spoken around the house, was pretty much it. And I went to residential school. I went to residential school when I was 7 years old. The Department of Indian Affairs had a policy, and every child had to attend residential school. So my parents would go to jail if I didn't go to school. And I attended Ishiporden Hall Indian Residential School, and I also went to Shinwak Hall Residential School in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. Residential school survivors were harshly disciplined. What happened to me was I was physically abused by a supervisor. We were told not to pass food around in the dining room to other students, and I got caught passing the slice of bread, and I was severely punished by the supervisor. I don't think all the survivors or the supervisors, staff, teachers were bad. This was a barbecue. They were having a barbecue this is my hockey team. That was when we won the championship in the winter of 1963. So they treated us with hot dogs and hamburgers and marshmallows, and we had a great time. I became an alcoholic around 20 around 20 years of age. Yeah. Many survivors use alcohol, or Native people use alcohol or substances as a coping mechanism to block your emotions and feelings. People are left with a sense of belonging. You want you want to find your sense of belonging and identity. First, I had to sober up. I've been sober for 25 years. So I went back to my traditions, my culture, and that's where I found.
Honey, another point that I just want to say at this point in time is understanding the ability to opt out of responsibility, which is what these European systems that affect particular groups particular ways, right, are able to do. There's this option to opt out of having or taking or needing to take responsibility, and a lot of that has to do with bureaucracy. Now, it no longer became acceptable to target Native American people, scalp them, and kill them for the land that they inhabited, right? That was no bueno now. So instead, they created a bureaucratic system that intentionally made it difficult for these people to exist, for these people to survive, in order for them to later be like, well, we were just trying to make schools for the kids. We were doing community development. And that is the diabolical nature for which European systems, settler colonialism is allowed to continue as it is. That's why there's that book called Slavery by Another Name, because slavery didn't really end. It's just now prison slave labor. You know what I mean? Things obviously went out of style, but if you rename it, rework it, and no longer have this blatant we're murdering you on purpose thing, we can kind of demystify it and make it seem like, oh, well, we were helping you, but this particular child was this, or this particular family was like this, or this community's complaining. We were putting schools in their areas. We were doing these types of things. So it's about the ability to opt out. This is why, relating it to African Americans and stuff, when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, when we're talking about police brutality, it's a conversation that is so nuanced and so difficult, even though the evidence is staring most people right in the face. Because a lot of people who do not want to acknowledge this to be true, the reality is the system works like that. When a cop sees a white woman versus a cop seeing me, depending on the cop, obviously, but the approach can be different. Certain things are allowed to fly with me that wouldn't be allowed to fly in that situation. And because the group of people with all the power are being indoctrinated and experiencing these things particularly deliberately in different ways, that doesn't show the danger, that doesn't show the harm, doesn't show even the potential for harm to exist, they are now able to deny us of our real lived experiences. They're able to brush it off and say, oh, well, I get pulled over. I've gotten pulled over and a cop's never drug me out or punched me out. So maybe it's something you did as an individual, right? And this is what this is. This is genocide by another name. So outwardly, we're creating schools for these kids. We're trying to help them. We're trying to do this. Even the church is involved. Looks okay to the untrained eye, but the violence associated with that act, the violence that these kids were subjugated to because of that, negates that. Oftentimes, the most egregious predators hide in plain sight. And a lot of times they're attracted to things like churches, Boy Scouts, things that really are like, wow, you're for the community, you're a good person, you're volunteering your time. But what they are really doing is looking for a shell in which to hide in plain sight. And oftentimes, these types of things are the perfect shell for abusers and predators to hide in plain sight. And a lot of them did in these schools, unfortunately. So the official record in terms of Canadian residential schools, these schools were owned and operated by the Canadian government from 1870 to 1996, which was the year that I was born. So, fairly recently. So obviously, very long legacy of the BS, child, of the BS. So the age limit or the age range of kids attending these residential schools from ages 4 to 16 typically. And before residential schools existed, there was something called labor schools, and labor schools were also another thing for which Native children were forced into, where they were forced to do manual labor, build things, all of that kind of thing, basically worked as slaves. Another time they reinvented it, revived it, made it a residential school where the kids still did manual labor, but that wasn't all that they did under the guise of this being a school. This is a quote from a man named Nicholas Flood Davin, and it was directly taken from Report on Industrial Schools for Indians and Half-Breeds, which is disgusting to say, obviously, but this is an excerpt. If anything is to be done with the Indian, we must catch him very young. The children must be kept constantly within the circle of civilized conditions. Okay, that was in 1879. This next excerpt is from Duncan Campbell Scott in 1920. I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there's no Indian question and no Indian department. And that was from 1920. So you see the intentionality here is to completely eradicate Canada, in this case, of the Indian problem. I would never refer to Native Americans as Indians. Let's just do a quick timeline, and I'm going to read it off of here, of how the residential schools were created, how they came to be, all sorts of stuff like that. So let's just do that. So in 1876, the Indian Act was created. It was a Canadian federal law that granted the federal government the exclusive rights to create legislation regarding Indian status, bands, and Indian reserves. Okay? In 1884, there were amendments made to the original Indian Act of 1876 that included the creation of residential schools. As previously stated, the schools were funded greatly by the Canadian government, Roman Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, and United churches. In smaller areas, though, individual religious orders could fund a residential school, and provinces funded these residential schools. An amendment was made that made it an absolute requirement for all Native children between the ages of 4 to 16 to attend a residential school. And in 1933, official guardianship was awarded to the residential schools after the forcible removal of the rights by the parents of these children. So just marinate on that for a second. I just went through a quick timeline of the creation of the schools and how slowly but surely the government amended this federal law in order to isolate further these children, reduce parental rights to nothing over these children, in order for the state to be able to claim ownership of these children and do with them what they wanted to, which is disgusting and sick, okay? Because you already know what comes after that. when there's nobody checking for you, when there's nobody that has the right to be able to check in on you, you are opened up to all sorts of abuses, exploitation, and things happening to you. And as you can imagine, that's what happened. So I'm just gonna go down a list of what survivors have said they experienced by going to residential schools. I think it's very important to note that in Canada, the last residential school in 1996. I was born in 1996. I'm only 26 years old. So bear with me when I talk to you about what atrocities happen in these schools. I'm just going to go down a laundry list and then we'll discuss in a second. Okay. Forced to never speak their language, required to speak English or French, required to adopt the religious denomination of their school, forced style of prayer based on the denomination of the school, forced haircut or head shave, use of toxic chemicals to wash their hair and skin, which they also did to the people in the ICE detention centers recently. So anyway, forced to wear uniforms, forced to shower, no baths, lack of nutritious diet, insufficient quantities of food, served spoiled food, separation based on gender, brothers and sisters forced to have absolutely no contact with each other, sexual assault, forced abortions, electric shock, forced feeding their own vomit, exposure to freezing temperatures outside, withholding of medical attention, exposure to contagious illnesses, such as refusing to quarantine children who had tuberculosis from other children, forced labor, vilification of their cultures, using racist language, withholding of visitation by parents, withholding of gifts by parents, withholding of letters by parents and families. Needles pushed into their tongues for speaking their own language, whipped with a leather strap, beatings, sometimes till unconscious, starvation, public shaming, public beating of naked children, genital searches, obviously sexual abuse, and locking in basements or cages. Again, let me reiterate, the last residential school closed in 1996. Okay. On top of that, while researching this, I found this out, which was super crazy, was, of course, this population of children were being experimented on. Yay! You know how you look at the back of a cookie wrapper or chip wrapper or anything that you consume and it has a list of nutritional facts. Have you ever wondered how they got the data in order to determine how this particular piece of food has this many nutritional facts or is lacking in this nutritional fact or whatever? You wonder why? Of course, exploitation racially, and of course it had to do with the residential schools. Who would have thunk it? Not me. But that's how petty racism is. You know, I don't want to get on a rant, but that's how petty racism is in these European nations, child. That even you looking at a nutritional fact on the back of your Doritos chips has to lead somewhere to exploitation of an indigenous community. Okay, so let's talk about it. There was something called the First Nations Nutritional Experiments, where a series of experiments were done on around 1,300 indigenous people. 1,000 of those 1,300 were indigenous children in residential schools. And basically the goal of this experiment was to find the optimal levels of vitamin and nutritional molecules in their food. And so the Canadian government sanctioned these experiments to be done in order to be able to figure out the optimal levels of health and vitamins in your food. Now, this was done in the 1940s through to the 1950s, and of course, the primary people who were being experimented on were residential school children because, again, the state had guardianship over them, so their parents had no rights to object to this, and they were too young to even know what was going on, so of course, they were exploited. And in these experiments, they were refused medical attention, they were starved, and they were basically intentionally malnourished in order to see what would happen to them. Some kids died, of course, as you can imagine. But during that time period, the malnutrition in the residential school system could be attributed to this experiment happening. So, yay! And it wasn't until 2013 when a doctor of nutritional history and health decided to do a study and a deep dive, found out that this happened. So this was fairly recently that we found out that this was something that happened. So yeah, what I want everyone to take away, let's just take a moment to like understand that and like fathom that and understand what these children went through and understand how unprotected they were, how exploited they were, what they had to live through, and just understand the heaviness of that generational trauma for a second. Let's just like sit here in reverence of that. But what I want to point out is the indigenous population, Native Americans, First Nations people are still fucking here. Okay? And I just want to hammer that point home because it is amazing that you are still here. It is amazing that you are still able to pass traditions down. It is amazing that you are still steadfast in your community existing because of how hard they actively tried to kill you off. And despite every obstacle, despite everything put in your way, despite everything done to hurt you, to minimize your contributions to society, to minimize your help in creating society, to minimize your existence, you remain here. Not only that, but your traditions remain here. And that says so much to me. Because some people may ask, like, well, why do this? Why would they do this? And the reality is, the existence and the continued existence of the indigenous population in Northern America is a direct threatening of the legitimacy of the Europeans' claim that this is their land. The fact that you still exist is going to constantly always be a threat to their legitimacy of owning or ownership or creation of this land, of this society. And that is why they will try and try and try and try through different avenues, through different ways, through the different generations to try and make sure you don't exist, but you still exist. So understand that. That's beautiful, that's powerful. And I draw a lot of inspiration from just the tenacity, the force, the passion, the power of indigenous people and everything. So yeah. I think another thing to really hammer home is the fact that, again, the heaviness of this trauma and how does it manifest as an adult. There are a lot of mental health issues that survivors have to deal with, physical issues, addiction issues. Addiction is a huge issue in this community of people who survive residential schools. And can you blame them? No. So I think, you need to understand that the last residential school ended in 1996 in Canada. So the reverberations of this institution existing have yet to be fully explored. So let's talk about it. You may be asking, what happened? What happened? Did they sue? What's gone on? And I'm going to read that part of the story for you. So on March 8th of 2006, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was put into action by the Canadian government as a way to financially acknowledge the hurt and pain done to the Native community. You can't put a dollar amount to that, but they tried. It remains to be the biggest class action lawsuit settled in Canadian legal history. It includes the following 6 main components. Okay. Number 1, common experience payment. So you can get $10,000 to an individual that lived in a residential school for one or part of a year, and then an additional $3,000 for every year you lived in a residential school after the initial year. The independent assessment process, so basically individuals who experience egregious abuses, there is an independent assessment process where you could stand to gain a maximum payment of $275,000 or a possible additional $250,000 if you can prove loss of income due to having gone to a residential school. Next, there's the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which was established in 1998 to create, reinforce, and sustain conditions that promote healing, reconciliation, and self-determination. The AHF encouraged and supported Aboriginal peoples and communities in building and reinforcing sustainable healing processes that address the legacy of the residential school history, including physical, sexual, mental, cultural, and spiritual abuses, and in the intergenerational impacts. But, of course, in March of 2010, the federal government announced that the funding to the AHF would not be renewed. As you may have assumed, they did not follow through on what they said they were going to follow through, of course. And it was predicted that the AHF would shut down completely by 2014. The AHF received initial funding of $350 million in 1998, and of course they were never funded again. And this is what I mean by, throwing money at a problem. Because, like I said, there's no dollar amount that can unsexually abuse someone. There's no dollar amount that can reverse time. You know what I mean? And a lot of these people have suffered greatly due to the abuses of the residential school system. What this means is it's drops in the ocean of what these people deserve. But what it's doing is it's doing what it's supposed to do, in that it allows the Canadian government to say, well, we acknowledged it in 2006, we paid you all that money, so what are you still complaining about now? And of course, there was no intention to continue to educate and heal from these experiences, because if there was, then the AHF funding wouldn't have been on the chopping block. It's all fake and phony, child. The last and final part of this settlement was Truth and Reconciliation, created to establish and contribute to the truth, healing, and reconciliation of these crimes. So several funding events and So there were several funding events all over Canada that discussed and educated people on the residential school system, and that was also part of the settlement. Which is so sad, because that's not enough. Like I said, you can't put a dollar sign to these things, but that is kind of where that kind of ended in terms of the legal legislative action taken to combat the negative history of residential schools. Like I said at the top, the effects of these schools, the history of these schools, the legacy, the reverberations are still being felt today and will be felt for generations to come, considering how long they were institutions in both America and in Canada. But I want to kind of sit here and kind of talk about why I decided to talk about this story. One, it's November. But two, this story is the exact example of why I wanted to start this YouTube channel. Because this story of residential schools, to me, is a true crime story. Just broadened out. It's not one man versus one person killing them. But the history of the residential school system sounds to me like directed, premeditated murder. Directed, premeditated violence, targeted violence to a specific community of people for the purpose of eradicating them. eradicating their future, eradicating the future existence of this population of people, which to me is a true crime story. The goal of this channel is to broaden our concepts of what true crime means. It's not just an individual situation. It's not just to individualize one person versus one person situation. It's about the systems that perpetuate violence to targeted communities of people after all of this time. This was genocide. Period. And genocide is a crime. And that means this is a true crime story. The goal of this channel is to be a place where we can talk about the individualized true crime cases that always encompass these whole systems in the background, as well as putting the systems on trial for the atrocities that they've committed to BIPOC people. So we're going to talk about individualized crimes, like traditional true crime, but that have the backdrop of systematic oppression. And we're going to talk about things like this that are just realities of history that are so negative, so hateful, but to me are violent, targeted, premeditated, and to me fit under the guise of a true crime story. So that's why I wanted to talk about this. We are going to be discussing the 60s scoop next week, which is kind of a continuation of the residential school system. And then the following week, we're going to be watching an It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia episode, talking about colonialism and breaking that down sociologically. So that should be fun. Yeah, I guess what I have to say is, all my socials are in the description. Check out my Amazon storefront, which I need to add more things to. Check out my Instagram. Check out my TikTok. We are almost 100,000 strong, which is really exciting. I'm more active on TikTok. I'm active like daily on TikTok if you want to check me out there. If you're new here, thank you for watching this video. Thank you for subscribing in advance. Thank you for hitting that notification bell in advance. And thank you for watching all of my ads in advance. If you're returning, I love you. Thank you for returning. Mwah. Love you so much. Please comment, like the video so it can do well in the algorithm, and you had better watch my ads as well. Okay? What else can I say? We're rounding out the year. It's almost going to be 1 year of me officially on YouTube, which is crazy. And I just want to say, first and first, mostly, that I'm so proud of my accomplishments on YouTube. This has been a dream of mine for a long time, and to know that we're on the road to 10K is so exciting and so thrilling. And I just want to thank y'all for your endless support, your love of my content. It's just been such a thrill to do that with you and to be able to explore my ideas with you guys. It's been a learning process, and we're going to continue learning more. Next year, starting in January, I have a whole new series that I'm going to attach to this channel that is me documenting, because I've been documenting behind the scenes my whole first year on YouTube, and I'm going to give you guys tips and whatever, things that I did, things that I learned. So if you're curious about starting a YouTube channel with no following, no experience, stay tuned for that series. It's going to be called YouTube Tips for a Lazy Bitch, if you know what I mean. But we'll talk more about that when the year comes more to a close. But I guess all that's left to say is Black Lives Matter, free Palestine till it's backwards. Love you guys so much. Mwah.